Hi, welcome to Planted in the Word, week 28. And if you're reading along with us as we go through the Bible in a year, this is the point of the year at which we are going to start reading the prophets. So there are 15 prophets in all, but I want to take just a minute and talk about the minor prophets. Last week you read Jonah. This week you're going to start seeing more and more of them. I believe Amos is coming up, Micah is coming up, all these minor prophets. So let's talk for just a minute about what that means. There's really 15 prophetic books, 3 majors, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then 12 minors. Now, the majors are considered major because they're so large, and the minors are considered minor not because they're not important, but because they're just smaller books, smaller scrolls that were even put together. And what we're going to find is, even though they were different authors written at different time periods, there is a theme running through these that I really want you to be aware of so that you can see it as you read them. Now, we talked about the minor part. Let's talk about the prophet part. So prophets to us tend to be a mental picture of a fortune teller, but that really wasn't true to the ancient Hebrew. To the ancient Hebrew, a prophet had a few consistent characteristics. They were somebody that had had an experience with Yahweh, that were coming to the people to convey a message, usually to the leaders, but sometimes to Israel at large. They were communicating with them what the mistakes were that they were making, and then what the consequences of those mistakes were going to be. Now, it's the consequences part that tend to make them look as though they're fortune telling. But really what God had said is, listen, if you do this, these are going to be the consequences. And they were just relaying that. And of course, God is faithful to his word. And the things that God told him he was going to do, he did. So these prophets, in a nutshell, were constantly communicating with Israel the areas in which they were falling short. So Yahweh was giving them a heads up for what he was going to do. And he was doing that in a very specific way. So let's talk about, like most things, if we consider the minor prophets, it actually goes back to Genesis. What's going on here? Well, in Genesis, God made Adam and Eve in his image, also can be read as image bearers. That's the goal, relationship, and for them to bear his image. But over and over and over again through the Old Testament, we see the shortcomings and the failings, the absolutely abysmal failings of those that God had relationship with to actually be great image bearers of his name. And we're at the point in the history of Israel that we are currently at. God is in a covenant relationship with Israel. They are to be his image bearers now on earth. They're in a covenant relationship with him. He says, I'll do these things if you do these things. And you are really supposed to be an example. The nations all around you know you worship me. So when you worship me, the way in which you worship me reflects me. You need to be an excellent picture of who I am because they're watching. And Israel is failing horribly. And the things that Israel's failing at are sort of threaded all throughout the minor prophets as you read them. It's a pretty consistent theme. So I'm going to go over a few of them that you'll be seeing. First of all, God said, look, I'm faithful. I am faithful to you even when you're not faithful to me. And Israel constantly was not being faithful to Yahweh. All the nations around them knew that they were to worship Yahweh, and they watched them constantly fail into the worship of the Baals and the Ashtoreths, and they were falling apart, and the nations are taking notice. They were not faithful to God. They were becoming corrupted. So God says, I'm going to have to deal with that. The next thing God says is, look, I need you to keep my laws. I keep my half of my covenant relationship with you. You need to keep your half. But Israel wasn't doing that. For example, one of the things that God said of Israel is, look, I want you every 7 years to let the land rest. I'm going to provide you in the 6th year enough to last you all the way through the 7th year, all the way through the 1st year as you plant seeds again, until you're into the 2nd year in the harvest. I'm going to give you that much provision. And Israel didn't do it. In fact, it says one of the reasons that they went into exile in Babylon for 70 years is because each of the years represented one of the Shemitah years, the years of rest that they didn't let the land lay. So they weren't keeping their Torah. The other thing is God says, look, I'm a just God. I need you to be people that reflect my justice. But they weren't doing it. You'll see as you read, their magistrates were being purchased. They were taking bribes. The poor were losing in court cases, not because they were incorrect. They would be correct in their court cases, but judges were siding against them. And God says, look, you cannot continue in this behavior. You're not reflecting who I am. I'm a just God. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care about your status. I don't care about where you are. I ask you to be a people of justice. And they were not being a people of justice. And then the fourth thing that comes up is he says, listen, I ask you to be faithful to the widows and the orphans. I want you to show up for those less fortunate than you that cannot take care of themselves. Because God says, look, I showed up for you when you were slaves in the land of Egypt. I brought you out. I cared for you as a child. I was your father. But you are absolutely abandoning the widows and the orphans around you and behaving in such a manner that doesn't reflect my character. So these are really the four things that you will see as you read through the minor prophets over and over again, that God uses as a thread to draw Israel's attention to it. And eventually, yes, they do fall into, they are conquered and they're taken away for refining. Now, here's one of the last things that I want to draw your attention to, and that is the fact that each of the books also states or gives hope. It gives promises. So even though these minor prophets are really calling Israel and Judah, and I know that we're at a period of time where those are really divided kingdoms, but each of these prophets, the things that originally applied to Israel eventually really apply to Judah, as they are later called also into Babylon. But each of these minor prophets gives promises. They state that there is a hope and a future, that someday Yahweh is going to have such an amazing relationship with his people, all of those that follow his name, that his representative is going to come and have relationship with them on earth and dwell with them in perfect harmony. And that was the hope that he constantly is giving to Israel. Eventually, we are going to come back into relationship again. I hope you find that interesting. I hope you look for these themes as you're reading through the next few weeks. Thank you for stopping by. Have a good week. Bye-bye.